So I'm Gail Vignola. Getting emotional. This is my last event at Scholars for Syria because, as some of you know, most of you know who know me, I'm moving back to the East Coast after this semester. It's my last time at UE, so I'll talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to introduce tonight's presentation because it's my last chance to speak publicly about our program, and introduce Megan, who's going to be taking over my position as advisor. So thank you all for coming. I was hoping that people would show up on our last night and that we wouldn't be all alone, so it's nice to see a full house. Okay, so I would like you to leave here with 4 words, and then I will fill in those words as I'm speaking. I'm just going to speak for a couple minutes, and then Kirsten will introduce Dr. Shelby, because I think you're her advisor or something like that. No.
She spends enough time around.
Okay. So, 1 year ago, a young man named Abdul Hamid Yusuf buried his wife, his 9-month-old twins, and the rest of his family in Syria after bombs filled with weaponized chemicals fell on his town. So how do we in Indiana stay outraged and not become numb to the suffering that's been going on for 7 years? First, we think that a connection with our Syrian students and their families was a good way to start, and that's why this initiative started. And those of you that are lucky enough to know our Syrian students know exactly what we're talking about. So that's one way. The other way is to read reliable sources and keep yourselves informed. And now there are many unreliable stories both inside and outside of Syria. So it's hard to know what to believe. There's a lot of fake news, to use a quote, popular quote. So look for the good sources. Ask people who know. Ask Scholars for Syrian members, people who are informed with the right information. And teach yourself, read. It's the best way, other than speaking with Syrians, to keep up. And even though the cost of getting involved in work like this and trying to stop war crimes seems pointless sometimes, it's not. And I think the cost of remaining uninvolved and indifferent has been to us unacceptable, so which is why we're doing what we're doing. So we hope the fact that you're here tonight means that you agree with us and you're kind of part of our mission. So here's what you can do. So stay outraged is one way to take care of the problem of apathy and indifference. The other way is to stay engaged. So this photo is one of my favorites. It's on our Facebook page. In May of 2018, this year, UE will graduate its 13th Syrian scholar out of, or the original 23. We still have some to go. But we've graduated 13 Syrians from this school. This very generous, lovely, amazing school. But because of current prohibitive immigration policy, qualified Syrian students are no longer being allowed to come to the U.S. But the good news is that over 2,000 Syrian students are already here in the U.S. They've been vetted, heavily vetted. They're now refugees in the U.S. They have status, and they can come to college with the right amount of support, scholarship money. So this is a direction that UE can go. If UE wants to continue its legacy, and if you all want to continue the support of Syrians in our original mission, this is a way that the project can progress and continue what we started 3 years ago, and what started here at UE in 2012, when our first Syrian arrived, and he was one of my first students here. I think that was kind of a nice irony. So you can help by staying involved, pushing the administration, trying to work for initiatives like these, helping Megan, who's going to be taking over my position, Europe and Canada support refugee students. The U.S. does not federally, but there are ways to do it through private scholarships. Have fundraisers, raise money to help these students, help them learn English. A lot of them are less proficient in English than our Syrians were. There are ways to get around that too. All it takes is money and will and the passion to help. And obviously many of you have that. Send these students into schools once they get here. We have Syrians still here. Their going into schools is one of the biggest ways that we can change hearts and minds, to use a cliche, to get students of high school age to connect with Syrians. And they grow up to be voters and policymakers, along with those Syrians who are here as refugees, who because of their status will also be voters and policymakers one day too. So by planting these seeds of activism and support, you will be making a difference by helping this group, Scholars for Syria, continue the work that we started by going into schools. It's been enormously successful. You can go to our website and see how great it was, or talk to any one of us. Okay, so I guess, I don't want you to be among those who will look back in 5 years or 10 years and say, yeah, we wanted to do something, but we wrung our hands and we did nothing. So there are things you can do, even from the cornfields of Indiana. And I won't be here, but I'm not going to go to another planet like I told my group. I'll be in New York City area, but I will still be here in heart and in spirit, and there are such things as email and text messages and Facebook, so I'll still be around. So, Scholars for Syria wouldn't be where we are today without all of your help. My team, I'm not going to sound like an Oscar winner here and list names, but I'm going to give a collective hug to everyone who's helped me from the beginning, and there are just too many people to name. So I just want to thank all of you for helping us. And this year alone, this was one of our best years because of SGA. If anyone from SGA is here, we had 2 award-winning films this year. 3 Syrian activists who came all the way from New York and Chicago to be here in this little town because of this amazing community and people like yourselves. So we're really proud of that accomplishment, and it was a really good year. So I'm happy that this was my last year, and also your donations and support and gifts and merchandise purchases help the nonprofit that we started contribute to outside organizations like the Syrian American Medical Society, like the Qatar Foundation, like Books Not Bombs. All of those efforts help not only the Syrians here at UE, but their families and people in Syria who are the most vulnerable. The Syrians here are lucky, and they know it because they're here. But we collectively as a group can help support those who are their countrymen and women. So finally, I turn over this position, and Megan's not going to speak tonight, but I just want to introduce her. So Megan King is a Chi Omega sister and part of S for S, Scholars for Syria. I abbreviated it here from the beginning. She's been with us since the first year. So under her leadership, I know that this organization will carry on our legacy of education, advocacy, and support, and I look forward to continuing our partnership because Syrians in UE have changed my life. And this sounds really corny, but I've lived all over the US and I've had some really, really great teaching jobs, but this is the best job I've ever had, and I'm not just saying that. It really is, and a lot of it has to do with Scholars for Syria and this group of people. So even though I'm going to be far away in distance, I'll still be here in my heart. So I'm not going to get mushy now because I really will start crying. So thank you for supporting us, and take care, son.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you guys all for coming out tonight. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Rob Shelby. He is an assistant professor of sociology here at the University of Evansville, and I think I speak for a lot of students and faculty when I say that we're very lucky to have him. Among a number of other classes, he teaches race and ethnic relations, and so this evening he will speak about the ethnic hierarchy in America and how this can have a bunch of different consequences for immigrants who come to America, including Syrian immigrants and refugees.
Well, thank you. I'm actually not going to use the, is it necessary that I use it? I've got a pretty loud voice, and I can make sure this happens.
Can you raise the voice?
All right. I am incredibly honored to be here tonight. And I consider it a privilege to be here because so much of what I teach, I guess for some students, comes across as a bit excitable. I am excited about the topic of sociology. Yes? I will do that. Yes. I will do that. There you go. Okay. I'm excited about the topic of the discipline of sociology. And even more so, I'm excited about sociology because I'm excited about people. And I didn't plan on doing this, but I will tell a little bit about my story about how I even got into this discipline. And then I'll jump into this topic. I was, right after high school, I joined the military because I was not considered college material. And maybe that's true. I didn't feel ready for college, so that part is true. And so I joined the United States Army, and along the way I was deployed to the Middle East after living in Germany for 2 years. So during my time with the military, I spent more time out of the country than I did in the U.S. 13 months in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, and Iraq really opened my eyes to something that was already happening inside of me. My time in Germany illuminated me and my thinking to people who were marginalized. And that did not change when I spent time in the Middle East. I can tell stories. I won't do that tonight. But so it's incredibly important to me that we really try to gain a good understanding of how we kind of got where we are, why we're in the shape that we're in, and perhaps where we can go from here. So the title of my talk tonight is Immigration in Syria, Foundations and Consequences of American Ethnic Hierarchy. And part of what I'm going to do is try to tell the story of the American immigration narrative. And in the midst of that, kind of give some examples of different groups coming from different parts of the world to this great country of the United States of America. It has been a tattered history. And this history does not just belong to white people. This is a history that belongs to all of us. And we're going to have to figure out how we're going to deal with our history. So to begin, the onset of large-scale immigration, starting back in the 1600s, global colonialism was spreading across the world. Small-scale migration was taking place, so even though colonialism was taking place, there was really limited movement, or at least not to the grand scale that we'll see with immigration. And the primary people who are moving are government administrators, merchants, and soldiers. And of course, the African slave trade will be in full swing, will start and then be in full swing during this period. The 19th century brings on large-scale immigration. So folks are coming to the United States, to Canada, to Brazil, and Argentina. there are some structural forces and some individual forces that we have to consider when thinking about modern immigration in the United States. Population growth due to demographic transition was really exacerbated by the fact that there were high birth rates and lower death rates. So we had more people on the planet, which means those people had to live somewhere. So we see lots of movement starting to take place. Secondly, industrialization begins. So the ability to be able to move from place to place, and this kind of dovetails nicely with technological innovations, it allows people to move from place to place of their free will, but that means that there's also some unintended or some the push-pull factors that I'll get to that really kind of exacerbates the movement of people. Some of the individual dynamics of immigration, most simply, for some, is just individual motivation. This is the very positive side of immigration. Folks are moving because they want to. There's obviously a need, and I'll talk about these two factors now. In sociology, we talk about push-pull factors. Push factors are economic, social, and political conditions in the origin society that create stimulus to leave. It is a push out of that origin society, and people have to go somewhere. Now, in the case of Syrians, what has been noted as the civil war, wrongly labeled, is a push factor. If you talk to most Syrians, as much as they enjoy the U.S., they also love their home country. Am I right? So that is one component. The other factor is a pull factor. When we talk about individual dynamics, these are conditions that exert attraction to target society. And perhaps when we think most notably about immigration in this country, we think about the country to the south of us, Mexico, and folks moving from the south coming to the U.S. illegally across the border. Well, that's because there are jobs. In some cases, it is safer. The education system is stronger, so on and so forth. So these serve as pull factors. Lastly, on this point, there are social networks. So the migration chain that is established through early immigration policy then allows for family members to be able to move easily to the United States because family has been established. I should note right here that in conversations that the Trump administration or the policy that they've been trying to propagate, this is one of the areas that they want to stop. They want to stop chain migration. So migration systems. Migration systems consist of both macro and micro factors. And I'm only going to really talk about the macro factors here. The macro structures, so government policies and global economy, provide institutional setting within which individuals and families make decisions about migration. So at the institutional level, this is where we see these policies being established and how it then connects to the global community. So what I want to do next is, I apologize in advance. It's going to come across perhaps a bit haphazard, but it's kind of messy because we have people moving at different periods in time, and they're coming in waves. And there's some overlap between different groups coming from different parts of Europe, coming from Asia, coming from the Middle East and other countries, and it's creating a very interesting mix here in the U.S. So this first period that I want to talk about here is the pre-first wave. I've got a lot of information here, but I think we need to spend some time here given the title of my talk, because we have to understand what is happening. The group that is known as WASP, this is a classic term that has been used to represent white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. This group originated from Northern Europe. They were the dominant non-native group prior to the 1830s. there was a group already here, groups already here, Native Americans, and white Anglo-Saxon Protestants arrive, and they become the dominant group. And it's not because there are more of them. In sociology, we don't really talk about dominance and subjugation based on the numbers. We talk about who has access to wealth, power, and prestige. And in this case, early on, this group established themselves as the power center. This group many of them were skilled and had family living in the Americas already. What this connects to then is what scholars call Anglo-conformity. The prevalent ethnic ideology for most of U.S. history. Now let me explain what this means. So, this doesn't just happen in the U.S., so let me be perfectly clear. But in the American context, when new groups come to the United States, there's a measuring rod by which all others must figure out how to assimilate. And for the United States, that group are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Like it or not, that's our history. Some of the characteristics that are a part of Anglo-conformity relate to ethnicity. So notice that this group was coming from Northern Europe, which means when those Southern and Eastern Europeans come, there's going to be problems. And this begins, well, I shouldn't say begins, this continues a long history of the inability to deal with groups of people who are different than this primary group. Religion will also become a major sticking point, and I will talk about this in short order. And culture more largely. So thinking of the values and the beliefs and the traditions that people bring with them. If they are more similar to the dominant group that is already in the country, that group that brings these closely aligned values, beliefs, and traditions will be able to assimilate easier. But if there are differences, their assimilation process will be more problematic. So I say here again that what this Anglo-conformity has done is it really has established, really solidified this group with wealth, power, and prestige within the American culture. This contributes to early and sustained success for American institutions. So here's the connection. So if we want to know how we got to this point, the very institutions that we're having issues with were established by the dominant group way back in the 1800s, or prior to the 1800s. And it has been sustained all of these years. So the first wave. This is what is known as old immigration, or the first great wave. And this is the beginning of large-scale immigration to the U.S. There is growing demand for labor. So people are coming here in order to work. Some are going to be leaving their countries because of those push-pull factors. And two large groups will enter the U.S., the Germans and the Irish. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Germans, although the state of Indiana, and specifically southwest Indiana, you don't even really have to know too many people. But if you drive on 41 going north and you see the bank called German American Bank, and you see a town called Hofstadt, it's like you start to figure there's some German influence here, okay? And there is. The Irish, however, will be a very interesting group for us to look at, and I'll do this on the next slide, but they're starting to enter, and there is relatively easy assimilation that's happening. The Germans are assimilating well because many of them have shared religion. Protestants, right? And they look like the dominant group that's here. That helps. Discrimination and prejudice then begins really against Catholics. And I'll talk about this Irish Catholics really face it. But it's not just them. When the Italians immigrate to the U.S., they also face lots of prejudice and discrimination. What's really fascinating to me is that those who have really documented the groups that were entering the U.S. during this period, there were Syrians here. They were a very small number of them, but they were coming to the U.S. as well. Because at this time, the Ottoman Empire was starting to fall apart, and those coming from the Syrian region of the Ottoman Empire began to immigrate to the U.S. Now this group is interesting because part of the reason there's some success for this group, although they're still vilified to some degree, but many of them were Christians. So we're not really talking about Muslim immigrants coming to the U.S. just yet. So this group was able to assimilate rather well, fairly well, relatively well. So a word or two about Irish Americans. So this first large-scale immigration among this group of non-Protestants. The first influx of low-skilled workers destined for mills and factories. They were being persecuted within their own country as one push factor. The other major push factor was the potato famine. This gave rise to a virulent nativist movement, meaning that those who were already established in the United States saw this group as a problem, and the Irish really faced lots of prejudice and discrimination. And let me explain briefly. My students already know this, but I want to make sure you know what I'm talking about. When I say prejudice, what we're talking about in sociology is really, these are ideas that we maintain in our minds that are normally negative about a particular group. So prejudice then is connected to stereotypes. Okay? But it's not just about prejudice, it's also about discrimination. And discrimination is then acting on those ideas, those negative ideas and those stereotypes toward that group for whatever reason, right? So moving from idea to action or behavior. With this large influx of non-Protestants, Irish Protestants, non-Irish, these were Catholics, Irish Catholics, this prompted a redefinition of race. And I'm really fascinated by this because for race scholars, we look at how race is even formed. And here is the period that we see the start of the clarification, the definition of what it means to be white. It's right here. The Italians also are coming to the country during this first wave. Many were poor and uneducated. They were agricultural peasants from southern Italy. Primarily, this group consisted of men who were intending to move back to Italy. So they weren't really intending on staying here. They wanted to gain wealth, at least gain some financial stability, and then go back home. Most settled in cities, working in low-paid, unskilled jobs. Most were loyal to their provinces or their villages back home. So they were still connected to home. There were also Asians immigrating during this period. In the mid-1800s, Chinese immigration began, and I also want to make sure that this is clear. Whenever I just kind of go very quickly on things like Chinese immigration began, that means that there was a policy that was in place by the U.S. government that was looking to bring this group in because we needed them for something. We needed laborers. And the Chinese are going to fill this gap for us, especially as you think about work that is being done in the mines in California and the development of the railroad system in the U.S. Mostly males coming to the U.S. seeking economic opportunities. They were seen or perceived as a labor threat. This is also a pattern, a consistent pattern that we will find that depending on the economic situation in the U.S. at the time of these immigrant groups coming in, this group will be vilified and seen as a threat. primarily as it relates to labor. The Chinese Exclusion Act was signed into law in 1882 by President Chester A. Arthur, and it is exactly what it sounds like. There was an act that was passed into law that excluded the Chinese from entering the country. So, does this sound familiar? This is why history is so important. And I'll make some comments about President Trump at the end. And you may hate me for real at the end of that, but we'll see what happens. In the late 19th century, the Japanese then replaced the Chinese. So the Chinese Exclusion Act stops the Chinese from entering the country, but we still need the laborers. So we just pick another country. We allow the Japanese in, and they replace the Chinese laborers. And they begin working in the agricultural industry in California. And guess what? This group is vilified and seen as ones who are stealing jobs. Surprise, surprise. The second wave. Also known as the new immigration, now Southern and Eastern Europeans are starting to enter in large numbers. Mainly industrial workers. Notice that they're always settling in cities. In sociology, there is a very good reason for this. You tend to find more people like you, and there tends to be greater tolerance in cities. The 1920s, the restrictive quotas that had been were enacted by Congress during this period. So the Immigration Act of 1924, signed by President Calvin Coolidge, also known as the Oriental Exclusion Act. I love language. It is so fascinating to me. So we went from the Chinese Exclusion Act. We stopped the Chinese from entering the country. We allowed the Japanese to enter the country. We kind of get our fill of that group. But the Chinese Exclusion Act doesn't cover them. So we need the Oriental Exclusion Act. Okay. 1943, President Roosevelt will repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act with the Magnuson Act. And I was so excited when I was studying this and reading something like, yeah, FDR, way to go. Yeah, but a year prior to repealing that act, in 1942, the Japanese internment began. That was legal, folks. In this country. Does this sound familiar? I mean, I feel like if you just change the names of the people, we keep doing the same things over and over. In 1965, legislation ended Asian exclusion altogether. It was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. Other Asian groups came as well. Koreans came after the Korean War. Some came as war brides and as refugees. Got to notice how we treat refugees. This group didn't assimilate very well initially. In more recent years, many are in the urban middle class. They're college educated and they're professionals. Many own small businesses. So sometimes this group is looked at as like, well, it started off rough for them, but look, it looks like they've assimilated well and they're accepted. Yay for us. This project has worked. Filipinos. Many came early to replace Chinese laborers. At the same time the Japanese came, they just came in very small numbers. There's a significant percentage of Filipinos entering the U.S. in more recent immigration policy. The Vietnamese also came to the U.S. Most came as political refugees following the Vietnam War. They remain the most economically depressed Asian group. Lastly, Asian Indians coming from the country of India. Most of them came in 1965. Highly educated, occupationally skilled, and that's not a mistake. How do you think that group came? Right? Not just Asian Indians, but they were highly educated and occupationally skilled. That means that we had policy that was looking to allow those groups into the United States. That sounds familiar too, doesn't it? Yeah, somebody's just trying to repeat history, in my estimation. Again, here, many own small businesses, which for some, we use as a means of success and assimilation. This group is doing fairly well. The Latin experience, the Latino-Hispanic experience. Now, Puerto Ricans were living on the island, but many of them will now leave the island and come to the mainland and settle primarily in the upper northeast, New York and New Jersey. In the 1950s, this group moves from the island to the mainland for economic reasons. Cuban Americans in the 1960s began entering the U.S., settling primarily in Miami, Florida. And they're coming as political refugees, and American policies supported Cuban entry. Lastly, for this group, Dominicans, Central and South Americans began more recently to enter the U.S., and many are coming because of economic reasons, but quite a few are coming for political reasons. The Arab experience during this second wave, and I use this term not to offend anyone, but I have a love-hate relationship with the U.S. Census. And my students know this because I bring it up all the time. But this is how the U.S. Census categorizes this group as Arab. Oh boy, that's really not a helpful term. Because it means anyone coming from Arab countries or Muslim countries, which we see primarily as synonymous in this country, which means then there's no diversity. But we don't just do it with this group. We do this with Hispanics and Latinos. We do this with Asians, right? Asian American, Latino Americans, they're all the same, right? They speak the same language and have the same traditions. That's not the case. So in 1948, and many of you know this history, what came as a result of changed political boundaries and conflicts, namely the creation of the State of Israel, then exacerbated the movement of people. This came with higher socioeconomic status than the first wave, smaller group of Arabs that had entered the U.S. Many university students stayed in the U.S. after the completion of their education, and now most were Muslim. A small part of immigration in the late 19th and 20th centuries, most were from the Syrian region, believe it or not. And they were classified as Lebanese Americans. My favorite professor in my undergrad experience was a Lebanese American at a Christian college just north of Chicago, teaching Old Testament Bible. Oh, wow. Oh, what an experience. This group was motivated by economic opportunity. They peddled goods and eventually opened dry goods stores. Most of this group were Christians and moved into the middle class within a generation. The third wave. Thanks to Hart-Celler, also known as the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, origin quotas were erased from immigration policy. Woohoo! We did it! It's also at this time that the foreign-born population in the U.S. will reach an all-time high. The Arab experience during this third wave started with the end of restrictive immigration quotas, and then a diverse set of folks will enter the U.S. From different geographic origins, religion, gender, and social class. They're driven by economic factors and political unrest, putting it lightly. Most are Muslim, and most came as family units intending to stay. So when you hear news reports talking about immigration reform, many of these same pieces that are kind of the mainstays in American immigration policy are the very pillars that are being chipped at. This is another one, trying to chip away at the family unit component. So I've said a lot on this point, but I want to make sure that at least here you understand where this leaves us at this stage. It leaves us with a hierarchy within the American social structure, where the top tier remains white Protestants, of various national origins, but the ethnic significance has been lost for this group. It is very challenging when talking to folks among this group and you say, so, what are you? You say, well, I'm white. I'm a mutt. I have family from Germany, I have family from Austria, I have family from Italy, I have so on and so forth. And so it's just kind of like this mishmash. And then many of them will just say, I'm American. Why do you ask? This is that top tier group, generally. The intermediate tier, or this middle group, are what are called white ethnics. So these are various national origins, primarily Catholics, Jews, Asians really are classified as racially white in this country, which is just a mind tweak, let me tell you. And there's a decreasing ethnic significance for this group. The bottom tier, then, is comprised of racial ethnic groups. African Americans, Latinos and Hispanics, and others. The question will become, where do Arabs or where do Syrians fit? Believe it or not, the U.S. Census is doing just a bang-up job on this point. They're going from bad to worse. They classify most coming from Arab countries as white, racially, when they come to this country. And I should mention, this is perhaps, other than Brazil, this is the most racialized country that you will find on the planet. Where ones who are more closely aligned with being racially white have a greater chance of social success, socioeconomic success, than those who are further away. My case in point here is simply looking at Latino and Latino Americans. So Cubans fare better economically in this country and in education, almost on all of the demographic indicators, than Dominicans. Now it's true they're coming from different parts of the world, but Dominicans look more like me than their Cuban counterparts. Cubans can actually pass as racially white in this country. So prejudice and discrimination. Most Americans fail to distinguish the difference between Arab and Muslim. We conflate the two. Generally, this group is seen as mysterious, violent, and villainous. And it doesn't help. Our media helps socialize us to these false truths. So Islamophobia, then the fear of and hostility toward Muslims or anyone of Arab descent, is now really solidified itself within the American social psyche. It's based on modern as well as historical images and events. So there's a history that's in the backdrop that's helping to sustain these stereotypes. This group is viewed with a high level of mistrust and suspicion. Over half of Americans favored requiring the group to carry special identification. If you know anything about South African history, this should tell you something, yeah. Women from this group are viewed with a combination of oppression, because they wear the hijab, and exoticism. Contemporary Islamophobia contributes to the perception of this group as a cultural threat. So do you remember earlier, in those earlier slides, I was talking about different groups coming to the U.S. and they were seen as a threat to jobs, to labor. And now we have a new group of refugees coming to the U.S., or no longer, right? That's been frozen, stopped, who are seen as a threat. there is very little knowledge that Americans have of Islam. So when there's very little knowledge, you're left with stereotypes. Stereotypes of Muslims as terrorists. Discrimination, then, we can talk about the intensification of individual acts of discrimination after terrorist incidents anywhere in the world. If a heinous act takes place, one of the first thoughts that may enter our mind is terrorist act. And perhaps we then think what type of person it may have been to do such a thing. Other ways that we discriminate, using our actions, right? Moving from idea to action, is contesting the building of mosques or Islamic centers by local governments and residents. We see the increase of well-organized anti-Muslim organizations that then act upon and inflict hate crimes upon these groups. Additionally, in 1972, the U.S. government began collecting information on Arab immigrants and organizations. Did you know that? Yeah. Do you know that the Patriot Act, it's post 9/11, right? Sanctions monitoring the legal residents without their notification? Yeah. They are repeated targets of racial profiling. This isn't just happening to black people in this country. Okay? If you've traveled on an airplane recently, yeah, it's so blatant. It's not even funny. And if I shave off my mustache and just keep my beard, oh yeah, it's going to take me longer to get through the check-in. General tolerance for anti-Arab prejudice and discrimination. But let's talk about assimilation. As I mentioned earlier, some Arab groups have assimilated fairly well. And I use here Lebanese Catholics as an example because this community has followed the classic passage to assimilation. Because the religion is somewhat similar, right? Well, it is Catholic, even though Protestants, and we can debate if we're still mostly Protestant here in this country. But they've followed this line of connecting to educational institutions and doing well there, which then translates into better employment, higher wages, being able to move from one geographic location to another within the U.S. There are also high rates of intermarriage among this group and residential dispersion. So people among this group are moving from those cities into the suburbs, and some even moving to rural areas. So in conclusion, I wanted to share a few points, a few things for us to think about. American U.S. history is a tattered one. To put it in common parlance, it is a hot mess. I don't think I can publish that, but however, this was something that I think is really emerging as we look at the patterns of American immigration history. However closely that new group matches the characteristics of the dominant group will determine that group's future, and I'm talking here about success or failure. Let me explain, perhaps. So for Syrian refugees entering the U.S., this assumed that we had favorable policies for Syrians entering the country. If they had characteristics that would closely match the dominant group, their chances for success would increase. We've seen this as a pattern. Notice that I haven't talked about African Americans at all, even though as a forced immigrant group, it's fairly clear to see that we don't share some characteristics. right? Our skin color. It's so obvious, right? So assimilating really means how quickly one can pass for being a part of the dominant group. Language then becomes a really important characteristic that has to be addressed. A third point here, thinking about here in conclusion, what does the group represent to Americans? And I put history after this. It does matter what kind of historical relationship the people group has had with the United States. Let me explain. So the Japanese internment camps, we actually justified this because the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. We had Japanese Americans living in the U.S. Matter of fact, we invited them into our country because we had stopped the Chinese. Remember that little piece of history? But now, because the Japanese are now seen as our enemy, the belief was that this group of Japanese Americans were probably spies. So you have to lock them up out in the West, in deserts, in the mountains, in order to keep them safe and to protect us. Does that sound familiar at all? We're doing this with immigrants. We've been doing this with immigrants for almost as long as immigrants have been coming into this country. So it does matter what kind of history we have. And it's really sad when we don't understand our history. So the events, the tragic events of 9/11, the bombing of the World Trade Center prior to that, and then the assumption that anyone that resembles those who did those heinous acts would be the same type of people, just shows you how narrowly we understand humanity. My fourth point, prejudice and discrimination has become normative in American society. I wish I didn't have to put it this way. It's tragic, but it is the norm. Inequality it's woven into our fabric. I was telling my students earlier today, our education system is also a bit tattered. And so by the time some of these juniors and seniors take my race and ethnicity class and they find out so much about Native Americans, and some of them say, why did it take so long for me to hear this, to read this? Well, there have been little threads that have been dangling throughout your education experience. And if you start to pull on any one of those threads, it's all a part of the same tapestry. Prejudice and discrimination, inequality, it is woven into our social fabric. Which means we have to root this thing out. It also, a point of consideration here, is we have to think about the rate at which a group is able to assimilate. So, what I mean by this, if a group is able to assimilate quickly, they will find relative success. I have a friend who lives in Louisville, Kentucky. He is Muslim. But if he were standing here, you would not believe he was. He has blonde hair and blue eyes and pale white skin. He's from Bosnia. He told me his story of leaving Bosnia and coming to the U.S., and it just really is a great example of just what we're dealing with. So in Bosnia, he was a part of the vilified group because he was Muslim. He was Bosniak. Just by getting on a plane and coming to the United States, he became a part of the dominant group because he looks like a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He said, I've never seen anything like this. This is fascinating to me. I said, it's fascinating to you. It's fascinating to me. I've been here my whole life and can't seem to fit it. You can do it in 15 minutes. Anyway, inside joke. Last point here. So depending on the social temperature of this country, Our refugee policies do not favor those in need. You would think, after the history of watching people suffer around the globe, that we would be jumping at the chance to help people who are suffering like this. You would think this, right? Yeah, that famous quip that came after the tragedy, the horrific events of the Holocaust. Never again. What? We keep doing it. And it's not just happening in Syria, folks. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, the Rohingya. It's happening all over the place. And what our policy is to close our doors. Shame on us. I'll leave you with this thought. How does all this change? Because it has to. People. We are the ones who do it. Even when we have leaders who are unwilling. It's us. It has to be up to us. Because they won't do the right thing. I think that's the advantage of living in a democracy. But let me say this. We can look at this as a situation that is just far too big for us to even tackle. We're wrong. My people have a history of overcoming. It can't just be about black people overcoming. If it's just about my people, we all lose. It can't just be about one particular group doing better. It has to be about all of us doing better, which means it's going to take all of us to make this right. Thank you.
Introduce the seniors. I kind of didn't do that, so do you mind?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Shelby, for this celebration with us tonight. I'd like to invite the seniors who are speaking tonight. So as Gail said, we have now graduated proudly 13 seniors from the University of Evansville, which seems remarkable considering our size and location. But we are so proud of so many, including these three wonderful. Maybe.
He's getting a chair.
Oh, okay. Here's one over here. No, okay. There's one over here.
I think he's working harder than he has.
So I'll let them introduce themselves, but please join me once nothing. It's in here. We can startle him with some.
You made it.
I can start since I'm standing on the right. My name is Hasib. My name is Abdul Hasib Al-Jandali. I go with Hasib. That's what everybody refers to me. It's easier, it's quicker, and helps me look similar or blend easier. And not look mysterious and villain. Abdul starting at the beginning, you know. The servant off, it's kind of scary. Anyway. So, my name is Abdul Hasib Al-Jandali. Everybody calls me Hasib. I'm a senior mechanical engineer right now with a chemistry minor.
Volunteers.
I'm a senior mechanical engineer with a chemistry minor. Hopefully continue my chemistry degree in the upcoming year at UE. So although I'm graduating not completely. I will continue working as a quality engineer in Evansville at Berry Global once I graduate, so that's my plan. And they'll be paying for my more schooling, so that's great. Also, to help myself blend in more, I found a white girl that I'm marrying. You know, like, it's easier, like, anytime I'm meeting somebody, she's with me, they don't even question it, you know. It's not brown. Recently, actually, it hasn't been so long ago that I told her I'm actually not brown. When I'm filling applications, I found that out. I didn't find that out. I found that out as when I'm filling one of the applications. It says whites and then white for your gender or for your ethnicity, and then between codes it says people from Middle East to select what. I'm like, oh my God, I'm white. Hey, bro, you know, I'm white. She's like, I've been fake all my life. So being called white, I guess, helps to a certain degree. So at my job as now working as quality engineer, I'm the only international student there. I'm the only international person in there. The furthest person probably was from Kentucky. That was the furthest person working in my office. So it was fun to blend in, I guess, and they learned a lot of spicy food and a lot of Arabic words around on the boards, and it was an amazing experience. I had a lot of fun. I feel very integrated into society here. Came here not being able to speak English very well, and now I dream in English sometimes. I think in English. I have arguments with my wife in English in my mind, and I don't even have to translate it anymore. It just comes in English at this point. So, yeah, it's been an amazing experience for me here at UE. I don't want to take more of my friends' time, but it's been an amazing experience. I want to stay in Evansville. I want to give back to the community of Evansville. I grew up so much in here. I matured in here. I'm planning to bring my dad and mom here to retire and have the rest of their life in the U.S. with me. So consider myself a Syrian American if they can do that. And Brooke considers herself as an American Syrian. So in case we had to evacuate to Syria at some point in the future, we have to know or something there. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you so much for coming today. And thank you, Gay, for all of this. It's going to be a question?
Yeah, so you said that they learned a few words from you. Which is the most famous word you taught them?
Don't stop.
There's not necessarily a good word, but we say shit a lot. Okay? So that was the word that everybody learned from me there. Now, I'm not very proud of it. I say it a lot and working on stuff and all of that. So even in my fraternity, I joined a fraternity to help integrate with white people. I should start a how to blend with white people for dummies, you know? Yeah, I joined a fraternity and that was the most common word they all knew, so yeah. That's all I have. I'll give it up to Amir. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Amir Kayat Kahali. I'm a senior student here. I study chemistry as pre-med student. I'm originally from Aleppo, Syria. And I grew up there and then I left Aleppo after that war started. I fled with my family to Lebanon. I started high school there. I completed my high school degree and it wasn't the best experience. People are not that welcoming like people in the US. But then like I decided to study abroad and leave the whole area. And then like I got an acceptance at the University of Evansville. Don't know where that, other than like good picture on the website. I made it with my mom here. She just like came with me like for the first week, and she went back to stay with my family. And like I expected I would be like the only international student at UE. I realized there are more international students than the domestic one. And also like I didn't expect like to find Syrian students, and then I found like 23 students, and they're my family, I can call them, for 4 years. Then like I decided like to come and study. I wouldn't expect like to have like social life on campus. We don't have that experience back home. And then like I joined like a couple organizations, got blended with the community. Everyone was friendly. I made a lot of friends. Currently, I'm preparing myself for grad school, and I've started working too at very plastic. Yeah, it would be fun to job. Actually.
Chain immigration.
Yeah.
My work here is done.
That's it.
You said you just looked up on the internet and found the University of Evansville. Is that really how you found UAB, or how did you connect?
Like, I was sending emails to the IE, and they sent me a list with the university that are giving scholarship for international students or Syrian, and then like I applied to UE, and UE is the only one that accepted me.
But you didn't know anyone here previously?
No.
You weren't part of that chain?
No, they
Yes.
That chain immigration?
Well, we have
And another
another
question.
Wait, we have a question.
Sorry, just a quick one. Did you say what your major was, or did you not?
Yeah, chemistry.
Chemistry, okay.
It's not fun.
Everybody's done?
Okay. So my name is Ahmad, not Facebook, or actually nobody knows my first name is Ahmad, except for professors. I go by Nafe even since I was born in Syria, just because my grandfather went by Ahmad, and I had the exact same as my grandfather, so nobody wanted to like miscall somebody, so just everybody called me Nafe. And then how I ended up in the U.S. In Evansville specifically. So I'm doing an internship right now at SSNC. It's a financial services company, and literally everybody I met, like when they ask me where you're from, I say Syria, and they think 5 seconds, where is Syria? Like literally. So I had to say the story like many times, like why you chose Evansville, and then I said that I had many friends that were a year older than me. They came here to the U.S. and they got a great scholarship. So I applied and went through the visa process, and I got it. So I ended up in Evansville. I was originally studying in Syria since I was born. I went for a senior high school in Lebanon because the situation was really bad in Damascus where I live. So my parents told me that it's better if we move there at least for a year until the situation would like become better. And then when I finished my senior high school, they told me there's no chance you're going to go back and study in Syria. There was a lot of kidnapping, a lot of bombs, like we call Hawan. They come inside any house. Actually, I had a friend of mine who died because of that. It wasn't in Damascus, it was in another city, but that's the main reason my parents didn't want me to study there. So I applied, I got scholarship, I came here. I knew 3 of the guys, Hassan, Taysir, and Hashim. I knew them before I came here. And then it wasn't really like a foreign place for me because I knew those 3 that were here for already a year, so they made me friends with all of their friends. And I joined a fraternity that Kenan was a Syrian as well. So I joined there, he helped me out, and all that. I became more involved in campus. I was the treasurer for a national club. I loved it here. Everybody was welcoming Syrians. Everybody's friendly. And I'm graduating this May. I'm accounting and finance major. Should have said that at the beginning. I'll be moving to Charlotte, North Carolina. I was interning there last summer. I love the job. They offered me a full-time, especially that they don't have diversity in that office. I was the first person to work outside North Carolina. They were surprised that somebody applied for their office from outside that state. So they were really happy that I signed. I'm actually I don't like Evansville. I just prefer to live there more. You know, I come from Damascus. It's kind of a big city, so I just prefer a bigger city than Evansville, that's all. But I love the people in Evansville, and I'm gonna visit eventually. So, other than that, I think that's it. Anybody has a question?
Well, thank you so much again for coming out this evening. I can see Gail sort of giving me a confused look already. Because she made us promise that we wouldn't recognize her this evening. So she's giving me like the disapproving mom look that she gives to a lot of us. So, but like Gail said, my name is Megan. I have very big shoes to fill next year as advisor for Scholars for Syria. But I want to take this opportunity, as Kendra is pulling it up, Megan King 94. 94. Oh, okay. Yep. And take this opportunity to recognize Gail for all that she has done, because it would be a disservice not to this organization and to this university. My password. Ooh. Hot dogs. Just kidding.
All the time. I want to thank you so much for everything you've done for us. It's been a great honor for me as a professor and as a friend. And I will never forget the great moments we shared together. New York is going to be very lucky to have you there, but you will be missed greatly. You might be leaving there as well, but you're never leaving your Syrian family, as we will visit you. At the end, Gail, you're truly an angel, so I wish you all the best to you, Mr. John, and the rest of your amazing family. I'll see you soon.
Hi Gail, it's your old partner here. I want to thank you for the impact you've made on my life and the impact you've made on the community. When we started Scholars for Syria, you were managing the Writing Center, going for your master's, teaching a full course load, and you still made time every single day to put in work and make progress on our goals and our dreams of what Scholars for Syria could be. And you taught me a big lesson then that there's no excuse for inaction or silence. And that's something I'll always take with me. I've been to a lot of countries. I have friends from all over the world, and I've learned more from you single-handedly than each of those experiences. And that's something I never could have expected. I can't wait to see what you do in your next role, and I'm so grateful for our friendship and know we'll always be close. Congrats on closing the door to this chapter and looking towards the next. I love you, Gail. Thank you so much.
مرحبا جيل، كيفك؟ شو الأخبار؟ إن شاء الله كله تمام. These are actually words that Gail would use whenever sending us emails. And they were really long emails, but you know, we read every single one. On a serious note, thank you, Gail, for everything that you've done. I hope you're having a tremendous night. Even though you're leaving and this is your last event, but what you've done is going to last for years and years after you're gone. So thank you, I miss you, we all miss you, and thanks for being our American mom here. I'll see you soon at the East Coast. Thank you.
Hi, Gail. I have been saying lately how big of shoes I have to fill serving as the advisor next year for Scholars for Syria, and you lovingly remind me that your feet really are not that big. But in all seriousness, there is nobody who can do what you have done for this organization, Gail. Your unconditional love, your constant fight, your support of each and every student that you encounter, each and every human that you encounter is really undeniable. It's unmatchable, truly, and we are so lucky to have had you on our side. So we love you, we're gonna miss you, but we know that this isn't the end, and we're so excited to see what the future has in store for you. Thanks so much for everything you've done, Gail.
Gail, did you know that we met for the first time when I was 17 years old? At the time, you were an incredible teacher. But you've had so much impact on my life over the years that 5 years later, you became an amazing friend, mentor, and even mother. Gail, on behalf of every single Syrian soul that you've touched, and every single Syrian heart that you've moved, and every single Syrian mind you've influenced, I want to say thank you. It takes so much love, honor, and courage to do the things that you do. And I promise you that we're going to pay you back one day by making you proud of each and every single one of us. We love you.
The number one thing that you are to me, Gail, is an inspirer. You inspired me to know that if I want to take action on something, I am perfectly capable of taking action on it. And that's what you are. You are an encourager, you are a leader, you are a teacher, you offer so much guidance, you are a mentor. You are just, I mean, in all honesty, an inspiration in so many ways. Mostly because you believe in people, and therefore you inspire them to believe in themselves and to actually do something with that inspiration. So, there's so many things I could say about you that cannot be summarized in a little video, but I just want you to know that not only do I love you, but I appreciate everything that you did for me, and have done for me, and will continue to do for me, because that's just the person that you are. So, you are so generous, and I am so grateful to know you.
Hello again. I know the word thank you is not enough for all the time you have spent supporting Syrians at UAE. And I really appreciate all the time you have spent spreading awareness about what happened in Syria and what Syrians really stand for. I really want to wish you the best of luck in the future, and hopefully one time we'll meet. And thank you very much for being the best mom that anyone could ask for. Good luck, and hopefully we'll see each other soon. Thank you.
Gail, you are the most inspiring and fierce activist that I know, and I'm so grateful to work with you and know you and be able to be inspired by you every day. I'm so grateful for everything that you've done for us, and I know that everybody else feels the same way too. We love you so much, and I just want to thank you for teaching us to be strong and to fight for what we believe in, and just thank you for everything.
Hi. This video is for my favorite person, Gail. I'd like to say thank you so much for everything you've done for me, for Syria, of course. You've made a huge impact, and I'm so grateful to have you by my side. You're so kind and generous. I love you and miss you so much, and I hope to see you soon.
Gail, meeting you was one of the most pivotal moments of my college experience. I remember the first time that we met, you taught us the word wasta, which refers to someone's connections and influence to get things done. Since you taught us about wasta, I've learned countless other lessons from you. In you, I found a mentor, a role model, and a friend. You've taught me to be outspoken, to be resilient, to be a silence breaker. Thank you for being such a positive influence on my life. Your office has been a safe haven for me these last 2 years. I know I'm gonna miss our weekly Scholars for Syria meetings and all the little green heart emojis. I'll even miss schlepping all of the Scholars for Syria supplies to and from our many events. But most of all, I'll miss you. So best wishes to you, Gail, the woman with the biggest heart in all the WASTA.
So we're talking about Gail. Gail, just know that you're an amazing person. And I do remember all the times that you stood by us and you supported us. And we just can't say enough about what you did. I've known you for 4 years now, and I could never say a bad thing about you. I really do remember all the help, all the support, and I really appreciate it. And every one of us appreciate it, because what you have done is amazing, and you know that yourself. What you have accomplished is amazing, and you left an impact in the heart of every single Syrian that's here. What your passion just impacted all of us. Please know that we're going to be here for you whenever you need us, and to remember you for the rest of our lives, and we'll tell our kids about you. We love you so much, and we're going to always remember you.
Gail, we all know that your #1 goal has been to help Syria, and you've certainly achieved that. But what you don't fully realize is the strength of the impact that your kindness, fire, and confidence have had on all of us as individuals in the process. Scholars for Syria is a family as much as it is an organization. You are the head of that family, Gail, and we couldn't ask for a better mother.
I'm not sure I can think of a single word to describe how amazing you are, Gail. Thank you for being the most generous, understanding, caring person I've ever met. We love you so much. Good luck in New York.
Hello, Gail. I just heard that you're about to leave UE and move to Boston. And I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you for all what you've done to me and to the Syrian community in UE. You've been an amazing person for all of us, an amazing resource, whether it was by teaching us English, by spreading awareness on the Syrian crisis that's been going on for years now, or by just hosting us for Thanksgiving in your house while only Chinese restaurants are open in town. So I really thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'll come and visit in Boston. And, say hi to John, and I'll see you when I see you.
So I think there's a plot twist that you're actually moving to Boston, according to Kina.
This is the first I've heard of it.
Yeah, that's true. We'll come visit still. So
they have big shoes there.
Big enough. So will you all please join me in thanking Gail?